In 1984, cameras arrived in northern Ethiopia and showed the world what famine looks like. The images crossed every television set in the Western world. Children with distended bellies, mothers carrying children who could no longer cry. It became the defining humanitarian image of the 20th century. But 300 miles south of those cameras, something entirely different was happening. The same drought, the same heat, the same sky refusing to open, and almost no one dying of hunger. The difference between those two regions was not luck, not aid, not intervention. It was a single crop, one that had been growing in the same highland gardens for at least 10,000 years. A crop you could harvest on any day of any month. A crop that stored its food underground for years without spoiling. A crop that no amount of drought could ever reach. Nobody outside that region even knew its name. Welcome to nature's lost vault. The plant looks like a banana. It towers over a person, with massive paddle-shaped leaves and a thick columnar stem. It produces fruits that look like bananas, but they are filled with enormous black seeds. Nobody eats those. The food is somewhere else entirely. It is underground and inside the stem, in a place the sun cannot reach and drought cannot touch. Around 20 million Ethiopians rely on this plant as their staple food. They have done so for longer than the Egyptian pyramids have existed. Its name is Enset, and it may be the most important crop you have never heard of. The archive opens in the southwestern highlands of Ethiopia, a band of territory the locals call the Enset zone. It stretches from 1,200 to 3,100 meters above sea level, through the highlands where the Sidama, the Goraj, the Walaita, the Hadiya, and dozens of other communities built their entire food systems around a single extraordinary plant. Enset was not discovered. It was shaped. Over thousands of years, communities selected specific plants for specific soils, specific altitudes, specific uses. The languages of the Enset zone contain over 1,500 recorded names for different Enset varieties. Not 1,500 words about Enset. 1,500 names for distinct living clones. Researchers at the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew have spent years documenting this diversity and say the inventory is still not complete. The Goraj gave their varieties names that carry agricultural histories inside them. One called Astara means specific. Another called Kibina means soft or gentle. Another called Dera means common. Each name is a piece of knowledge. Each clone is a living library. This is not a crop. It is an agricultural civilization. To understand what makes Enset extraordinary, you have to understand what it asks of the land. Nothing. Enset grows from 1,200 to 3,100 meters above sea level. It tolerates extreme drought. Its deep roots store water where cereal crops cannot reach. And it does something no annual grain can do. It waits for you. Each Enset plant can produce up to 40 kilograms of food after reaching maturation. And because it is perennial, a household farm contains plants in every stage of growth at once. Something is always ready to harvest. You can plant it at any time. You can harvest it at any time. That is why every community that grows it uses the same name for it. The tree against hunger. In 2006, agricultural researcher Tilahun Ameda published a comprehensive analysis of Ethiopia's 14 major crops. His finding was unambiguous. Out of 14, Enset produces the highest yield per hectare and the highest energy content per kilogram of edible yield. Not corn, not wheat, not teff. Enset. And unlike a grain harvest you must race to complete before weather or pests destroy it, Enset can be left standing for 3 to 12 years, harvested when needed, left to grow when not. The plant is essentially a savings account buried in the earth. When the rains fail, the account is still full. But raw Enset is not food. What transforms it is one of the oldest biological technologies on Earth: fermentation. When a family harvests Enset, they scrape the pseudostem, pulverize the underground corm, and combine the two into a mash. That mash is wrapped in Enset leaves, pressed into fermentation pits dug deep into the earth, and left. Lactic acid bacteria and yeasts go to work. The raw starch transforms. Complex flavors develop. Nutritional compounds unlock that the unfermented plant cannot offer. What emerges from that pit, weeks or months later, is kocho, a dense, slightly sour fermented bread, rich in complex carbohydrates, minerals, and fiber. Alongside kocho, the plant produces bulla, a dehydrated juice, and a micho, a boiled root eaten like a potato. But the real power of fermentation is not flavor. It is time. Kocho properly sealed in a pit can be stored for years. Some families maintain fermentation pits that have been continuously active for decades, fed with new material, drawn down as needed. Not canned goods, not a warehouse. A living system underground, transforming and preserving food on its own for as long as the family tends it. The starter cultures that initiate fermentation are passed between families like heirlooms. In the Sidama region, the starter is called gamancho, prepared from mature Enset corms. In the Dauro zone, it is called gamma. In the Garage highlands, the method differs again. Each community carries its own version, passed between mothers and daughters, encoded in the cultures themselves. This is not food science. This is civilization. Here is what the 1984 cameras could not show. While the images of famine in Tigray and Wollo traveled around the world, while Live Aid was being planned in London, while 1 billion people watched the same footage of suffering, the communities in the Enset zone of southern Ethiopia were doing what they had always done: tending their gardens, harvesting what was ready, pulling kocho from fermentation pits their grandmothers had filled years before. The north grew cereal crops: teff, barley, wheat, crops that flower, produce grain in a single season, then are gone. When the rains fail, the season fails. When the season fails, there is nothing. The south grew Enset. When the rains failed, the fermentation pits were still full. Researchers who studied the famine record found a pattern that should have changed everything. The populations who depended on Enset had not suffered famine even in Ethiopia's most catastrophic droughts. Not in the 1970s. Not in the 1980s. While international organizations airlifted food into the north, the south simply kept eating. This is one of the most consequential agricultural stories of the 20th century. The world spent decades conducting famine relief operations in Ethiopia without asking why some communities never needed relief at all. So why did no one ask that question? The answer is not a conspiracy. It is something subtler and in some ways much harder to fix. In 1991, when researchers finally began studying Enset seriously, they found a striking pattern in the historical record. Development programs had consistently promoted cereal crops, crops that move through markets, generate export revenue, and plug into the global commodity system. One study from Royal University in Hawassa documented it plainly. The Ethiopian government had historically focused research and investment on cereal crops because cereals could be sold for profit. Enset could not. Enset does not fit the template. You cannot measure it in tons per harvest and enter it in a commodity ledger. It grows for years before it peaks. It ferments for months before it becomes food. The knowledge needed to grow, it lives in specific communities, passed through specific practices, not transferable through a seed packet or an agricultural extension pamphlet. This is why the Green Revolution passed Enset by entirely. The Green Revolution was wheat, rice, and maize. The tools built around it, the seed banks, the research stations, the extension networks, the development agency playbooks were all designed for annual grain crops that could be scaled, measured, and shipped. Enset had no equivalent institution, no CGIAR program, no place in the portfolios of the foundations that directed 20th century agricultural science. So the crop that had protected 20 million people from starvation was invisible to the organizations trying to end starvation. That is not a story of evil. It is a story of a blind spot built into the architecture of global agricultural science over a century. And that blind spot cost lives in the North because the South's answer was never studied closely enough to share. The researchers who are working to change this understand exactly what is at stake. Dr. Wendewek Abebe of Hawassa University has spent his career making the case. This is a crop that can play a really important role in addressing food security and sustainable development. His partner in this work, Dr. James Borrell of the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew in London, calls the Enset mystery one of the most puzzling in all of botany. Normally, when plants are this useful, they spread. Wheat spread from the Fertile Crescent to every continent. Rice followed water across Asia. Cassava traveled across Africa. But Enset, which outproduces every crop in its homeland, which feeds 20 million people without irrigation or synthetic fertilizer, has never left southwestern Ethiopia. In 2022, Abebe and Borrell published findings that put a number on the gap. Using climate modeling and agricultural surveys, they calculated that Enset cultivation could be expanded to support an additional 87 to 111 million people. Not just in Ethiopia, across Uganda, Kenya, and Rwanda. A 12-fold expansion of the crop's current reach is possible with existing climate conditions right now. 111 million people. The reason Enset has not made that journey is not soil, not rainfall, not climate. The barrier is knowledge. The fermentation is not optional. It is the entire point. Without the fermentation knowledge, the plant is just fiber, and fermentation knowledge does not travel in seed form. Wheat traveled because you drop a seed and come back in 3 months. Enset's knowledge system is practice-based. The starter cultures are passed between families like heirlooms. The scraping techniques that determine kocho quality are taught hand to hand. In Sidama culture, Enset processing involves the whole community. Neighbors gather to assist during harvests. The knowledge lives in the labor, not in a manual. You cannot put that in a seed packet. You cannot ship it in a container. This is why the international research partnership that has formed around Enset matters so deeply. Hawassa University, the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, the University of Leicester, the Ethiopian Biodiversity Institute, the Southern Agricultural Research Institute. They are not just studying a plant, they are trying to translate an entire knowledge civilization into a form that can travel before that civilization contracts beyond recovery, because time is running short. As younger generations migrate to cities, as cereal monocultures expand their reach, some of those 1,500 Enset varieties are quietly disappearing. The knowledge pool is contracting. Kew researchers currently maintain thousands of Enset seeds at the Millennium Seed Bank, working to understand the germination conditions that no one has yet mapped. This is not botanical curiosity. It is a rescue operation. What Enset offers the coming decades is not a luxury. It is a structural answer to a structural problem. The crops feeding most of the world were bred for stability, predictable rainfall, consistent growing seasons, regular temperatures. Those conditions are ending. Climate projections show catastrophic yield losses for annual grains across the same regions where the worst disruptions are coming. Enset was shaped by 10,000 years of human selection for exactly the opposite of stability. For the year the rains came late. For the drought that lasted 3 seasons. For the family that needed to eat in January when the last harvest was in October and the next planting had not germinated yet. It was designed for the world that is coming. The modeling shows it. Researchers project that even as climate change reduces Enset's viable range by 30 to 50% by 2070, an additional 47 to 70 million people across East and Southern Africa still sit within reach of it right now, today, with no new varieties needed and no new technology required. Just knowledge transfer. Just the willingness to look south and ask what those communities figured out 10,000 years ago. If you live in a highland climate where Enset can grow, small-scale cultivation is possible. Sourcing authentic planting material requires connecting with research institutions or diaspora communities that carry the knowledge. The work is slow, but it is the same work that built the fermentation pits that saved lives in 1984. If you cannot grow it, grow the idea. The next time you sit at a table where the conversation turns to food security, to climate, to what we will eat in 20 years, bring Enset into that conversation. Every crop that survives outside the industrial commodity system is evidence that food sovereignty works, that communities can build resilience from their own soil and their own knowledge without depending on supply chains that cross oceans and break under pressure. The families of the Enset zone did not need the 1984 famine relief operations. They had planted their answer 10,000 years earlier. It was in the ground, in the fermentation pits, in the 1,500 names no development manual had ever thought to write down. The knowledge is alive. It lives in fermentation pits dug into highland soil, in starter cultures passed between families like heirlooms, in 1,500 names for a single plant, each name a piece of the map. Enset did not disappear. It was never brought into the room. The question is not whether it can feed the future. It already fed the present while the world was not watching. The question is whether we are finally willing to pay attention. If this vault changed how you see the future of our food supply, do not let this knowledge disappear again. Subscribe to Nature's Lost Vault and hit the notification bell. Every like and every share helps preserve what the modern world ignored. The next vault opens soon.